Well, look, it is to be hoped that Australians are waking up to the fact that, sadly, our Prime Minister is not telling the truth about the voice. It's a terrible thing to have to say. But you'll recall that John Howard said last week to me, I'm affronted that there is such deceit and there is such an unwillingness to roll up your sleeves and explain what's involved. Deceit definitionally means misleading others. If you like to tell lies, then you are deceitful. Well, there was the Prime Minister in the Northern Territory saying that the voice was all about saving the lives of Aboriginal people, housing, health, education and employment. Does he think we're stupid? You can do that now. There's nothing to stop government building houses to help Indigenous people, or building hospitals or paying doctors to improve Indigenous health. Nothing to stop getting Indigenous kids into classrooms and having them properly taught. Nothing to stop prevailing upon employers to provide gainful employment opportunities for Indigenous Australians. This is deceit of the worst kind. All we've had from government and the proponents of the AEST case is bullying, vilification and name-calling. Now, the Prime Minister attended this weekend festival because he was on safe ground. But when a delegation of no vote Indigenous representatives, led by Jacinta Price, travelled all the way from remote communities to Parliament House in Canberra to express their views, Albanese and Linda Burney didn't meet them. It's unarguable that the Uluru statement from the heart is not what the Prime Minister describes as something that could fit on a single A4 page. It's 25 pages. Doesn't the Prime Minister know that? Or is he lying to us? John Howard's word, deceit. The Uluru State from the heart has three components: voice, treaty and truth. Images have surfaced of a T-shirt worn by the Prime Minister saying just that: voice, treaty, truth. As John Howard said on this program, it's preposterous that a nation should ever make a treaty with a part of that same nation. Treaties are between nations. And as John Howard said, and I repeat, it is preposterous to contemplate a treaty between Australia and 3.8 million other Australians living within Australia. Yet the current Prime Minister continues to deny that this referendum has anything to do with a treaty. But the Labor Party conference is on next weekend. A draft of Labor's platform says, quote, Labor will take steps, there it is, to implement all three elements of the Uluru Statement from the heart in this term of government. In this term of government. All three elements: voice, treaty and truth-telling. We've no idea what this bloody truth-telling is about, but anyway, as far back as 1986, the now Prime Minister signed an open letter calling for reparation, land rights and sovereignty to be granted to Aboriginal people, listen to this, in recognition of the effects of invasion. That is compensation, land rights and sovereignty. In layman's language, that means Indigenous Australians own the joint. He denies all this. That is the deceit. In a letter published in 1986, a young Albanese was the signatory to this statement. We believe that the granting of land rights and appropriate compensation is of fundamental importance as we approach the bicentennial, look at the word, of the invasion of Aboriginal land. The signed letter by the current Prime Minister referred to the illegal invasion of Aboriginal land and called for recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty, land rights and compensation, there are the words, for the social and cultural disruption. Make no mistake, the Prime Minister and his acolytes have an agenda here. And while the constitutional law professor Greg Craven may not like being reminded of it, he wrote in the Australian newspaper on March 24 that the constitutional words for the voice were, quote, a ruthless con job. Thomas Mayo, the man who stood next to the Prime Minister when Mr Albanese announced the referendum wording, is on record as saying that the voice is a campaign tool to, quote, punish politicians and abolish colonial institutions, pay the rent, pay reparations and compensation, unquote. But the Prime Minister describes the voice as an inspiring and unifying Australian moment. Thomas Mayo, who co-authored the book on the proposed constitutional change and sits on the Prime Minister's referendum working group, they drafted the referendum question, his signature is on the Uluru Statement. This same Thomas Mayo told a conference of communists, how appropriate is that? Quote, there's nothing we can do that is more powerful than building a First Nations voice, a black institution, a black political force to be reckoned with. And this same Thomas Mayo described the powers that be in Australia as, quote unquote, murderers. But the Prime Minister deceitfully describes the Voice as an inspiring and unifying moment. Mayo's views informed the design of the Voice, and he will be highly influential on the Voice itself if the referendum was successful. Make no mistake, the respected John Howard talked of deceit, and that message of deceit will dominate social media platforms funded by millions of dollars of your money from the government. They'll bump out a message which is untrue, using your money. The Prime Minister keeps saying virtually, vote now and I'll work out the details later. Well, I know Tom Switzer, the head of the Centre for Independent Studies, wrote earlier this week about a series of events his organisation will be conducting in Perth, August 20, Hobart, August 30, Adelaide, August 31, and Brisbane in September. He's calling these events a debate. However, he makes the important point that those opposed to this race-based change to the Constitution, advocates for the no case, are willing to argue the Voice issue on its merits. But the proponents of the yes case are not. Writes Tom Switzer, invitations have gone out to members of the Indigenous community who favour the change, to politicians in the Liberal, Greens and Labor Party, including the Indigenous Affairs Minister, and to philanthropists, corporates, academics, lawyers and television personalities. Writes Tom Switzer, none of these estimable people has accepted the invitation. As Tom Switzer says, it's odd that many leading proponents of the Voice seem so keen to avoid debate about what Noel Pearson has called the most important vote since Federation. Well, we've reached a point in this country, whether it's coronavirus, the demonisation of coal, the hoax of climate change and now the Voice, the proponents don't want debate. Oppose them and they'll vilify you and seek to cancel you. It's best in such an environment to rely on the people you trust. John Howard on this program last week fits that bill. He makes the valid point, I am affronted that there is such deceit and such an unwillingness to roll up your sleeves and explain what is involved. The current Prime Minister is unprepared to debate this issue. If Jacinta Price has challenged Linda Burney to a debate, as she has, and has been turned down, you must come to the conclusion that the government can't justify what it's asking you to support. It was I who coined the aphorism, if you don't know, vote no. And so it must be with this dishonest referendum campaign, with the Prime Minister of Australia disturbingly not telling the truth.